Good morning. My name is Mark Buckshawn. I'm sitting in my home office room in our home in Ottawa, Canada. And this is an experiment. This is my first live video. I expect the audience will be probably me, myself, and I. And that's fine. This is an experiment, and I just want to explore how to use these tools and experiments with them. Because that's one thing that I'm very thankful for at this stage of my life. I haven't stopped learning, stopped being curious, stopped being interested in the world, and stopped trying to find new ways to do things a little better. I live, as I think I mentioned, in Ottawa, Canada. And if you look outside the window, you can see the environment here a little bit. I'll just give you a scan of the environment, just to give you some context of the neighborhood I'm in. Yeah, it's a little snowy. It's winter. This is Canada. The last few years, the winters have been relatively mild. It's been almost balmy by local standards, but things this year were sort of back to the type of environment which I remember in Ottawa when I first moved to the city when I was 27 years old in 1981. I've been married since 1993. We have one child who is now an adult. He's 26 years old, 27 years old, and he moved out of the house with his girlfriend a year ago. And I had a business which I started in 1988, which is now in the final process of being sold to its employees. It's a publishing business that started as specialized local trade newspapers for the construction industry, and evolved, of course, with the arrival of online tools to a purely online product, and evolved to be both, I guess, what I describe as the smallest multinational business, one of the smallest national businesses in the world, because there's a separate U.S. side to the business and a Canadian side. Last summer, after some thought and working with my tax and personal advisors, we arranged a plan to sell the business to its Canadian employees. The idea here is at age 71, my tax situation would have been very onerous because I would be claiming my accumulated retirement investment funds, which would be taxable, plus old age and Canadian benefits, pension benefits. And all of this would push me into an incredible tax threshold if I continued to collect my current modest salary from the business that I was collecting. By structuring it and selling it to the employees and turning them basically a capital gains payout under Canadian rules, that money is tax-free. So essentially, instead of working for extremely hard for very little money, I'm actually working not so hard for quite a bit of money. And this arrangement lasts for 10 years. The Canadian business is now sold to its employees, but there's small part to transaction to complete, the U.S. side, and that involves some processes and paperwork, which will be completed probably in the next 2 months with a little quick trip to suburban Washington, D.C., which is where the business started back in 1990. In future episodes, I may share some of the observations about how this business got started, how it grew, how it evolved, and some of the crises and problems that had happened as it finally reached its point of conclusion. So here I am now. I've got a little bit of work to do because I still have some responsibilities for the old business. This keeps the cost of the owners down, the employee owners down, so they don't have to hire expensive consulting and certain work. And my responsibilities include some support on the editorial side, which is my background as a journalist writer. And it seems out the IT and systems operations has become my responsibility, including coordinating offshore contractors. I've enjoyed an interesting and surprising relationship with the company that owns this service, YouTube, Google, for about 15, 20 years. It started back in 92, 90. So somewhere no, it was after my marriage, but about 1998, 99, when I obtained an AdSense account and managed to blow it. What I did is I put it on some very sloppily produced sites with very poor quality, lacking content quality and control, and AdSense disabled my account. Now, the rule has always been with AdSense is once your account is disabled, you get a chance for an appeal. And if your appeal fails, you're generally then never to have anything to do with the program for the rest of your life. Well, that didn't quite work out the way with me. Um, I looked at the situation, and I had at the time a personal AdSense account associated with a blog. Now, by the way, these techniques don't work anymore. You can't try them any now. And so what I did is I cleaned up my business website, fixed everything all on it, made it very much compliant with policy, and then just swapped over my code on the website from the um, uh, business related account, which had been disabled, to my personal account. Much to my pleasant surprise, money started coming in after a few months of being sure that this wasn't a fluke and they weren't going to just disable my account again, which is the standard procedure if they see a relationship between the accounts that are disabled. I went to the AdSense help forum and started posting my observations and trying to help some other people with disabled accounts get their accounts back in order. Was fine, and I was getting known, and I was helpful, and I tried to respond to questions, and was starting to become a little more knowledgeable about the overall program of AdSense. And what happened was an interesting turn of events. Um, Someone who was a disgruntled disabled publisher um, didn't like my answer because I could just tell by his questions, by the sites he referred to, he deserved to be disabled, and there was no way I could give him any help to get back into the program. And I told him that. Well, he wasn't happy. Nick, by the way, just to give you an example of what we're dealing with, is called Cash on Tree. So Mr. Cash on Tree decided to start a revenge on me and mounted an incredibly severe sabotage attack on me. He did everything impossible, including, I think the word is Joe job, where you fake out that you're someone else, that he made it out looking like I was a scammer trying to exploit the program. Spammed emails with my URL, did all sorts of things to inflate my revenues that for means which I had no interest in doing. And I fought back as best I could. This lasted several weeks. Firstly, I removed all the AdSense code from my site. I just can't risk any problems here. And then I went on sleuthing measures to try to figure out who the guy was and get him to stop. Unfortunately, through methods, which I think it's something called, which now Google has finally caught on to this and taken measures. So again, this loophole doesn't exist anymore. So there's no harm in me sharing this. A function called AdSense for Search, which allowed people to set up a search box on their website, for some reason remained active outside of my control, but in the control of the bad guy who's causing my problems. And I guess he had it set up on his some sort of spammy website with my AdSense ID number. So even if I tried to do everything possible and remove all the AdSense code from my website, my AdSense account information was associated with questionable behavior still going on, and money was still coming into my account. In other words, I was making money from AdSense, even though I shouldn't have been doing anything, because the bad guy was deliberately trying to do that, so I would get my account disabled a second time. Imagine the anxiety this would cause. Well, I had something going for me, thankfully. Firstly, I was helped because I was known on the forum and other product experts were involved. There was a private forum for private product experts outside of Google's control where we could communicate with each other at the time. And they saw that I was doing everything I could to solve this problem. I was doing everything I could to help. And they advised Google staff responsible for the forum. They had some access to that person of my problem. And I received an email from the staffer saying, "Don't worry, we're aware of your problem. And and you'll be okay. A week later, I got the automated email saying my account has been disabled a second time. And I thought, well, it's probably over for good because the system finally caught up with me. And if you get one account disabled, maybe somehow get back. It's a miracle to get a second time. But if you're second time, you're gone. But I sent an email to the staffer who was responsible for the form explaining the problem. And within a half day, he responded, said, I see this problem. We're going to get this sorted out. They restored my account, reactivated me. And I solved the problem, isolated the guy who caused the problem, reached out his internet service provider, got him to report my situation, got him to stop the attack. And I was back in business. A couple weeks later, I got an email from the Google staffer inviting me to become a product expert myself, then known at the time was called a top contributor. And that resulted in the beginning of an interesting and somewhat surprisingly rewarding journey with Google. At first, I thought there was no real benefit to this other than access to a private forum, and maybe they'll send me a T-shirt or something like that. But it was a year later that Google decided to start hosting summits and meetups for their product experts or then top contributors. And I got an invitation to an expense-paid trip to San Francisco to the first summit. I've been to several of these over the years, and different U.S. cities. And a couple of years ago, last year, we went to London, England, which was quite an interesting experience. All of these experiences led me to get to know the company quite well. About 6-7 years ago, after one of these meetups at Google's offices in New York, I decided it was time for me to put some money where my mouth was, and I purchased some shares of Google, GOGL, in my personal investment account. The per share price was outrageously high at the time, it seemed, but I said, I think it's good. So I bought 25 shares, I think at $560 or $600 a share, US. And a couple of weeks later, it dropped down to 560. And I said, I still like this company. I'm going to buy some more. So I bought another 25 shares, making 50 shares, averaging out at $580 US. If you check the market, you'll see that the share price is somewhat lower. It's 185 or something like that now, US. But the point was they did a 20-for-1 stock split. So it doesn't take a lot of rocket science to figure that the capital gains on my Google shares has been meaningful. Obviously, I have other holdings. I'm not totally relying on Google for everything, but it's been an interesting journey, and I continue to be very engaged with the AdSense Help Forum. Not so much with YouTube. That's where I'm starting out now. Okay, so that little story aside might explain something of my philosophy in life. I dig into things with intensity with certain projects. I work on things, and sometimes I defy the odds and survive and end up with results which are unexpected but rewarding. In following videos, I'll share some of the stories of my growth and evolution, the beginnings of my youthful experiences, my exploration of the world, and some of my current hobbies and interests, including biking, cycling, and I still have a fascination and love of journalism, which relate to my young adult vision that I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. And I was 21, 22 years old on the student newspaper at the University of British Columbia called the UBC, finding my way into a path of a career in journalism initially with a work for a student newspaper for the year. And then I got a job in a roundabout way, as I often do, on a daily newspaper, the Vancouver Province, for the summer and part-time. And when I finished university, they told me I wasn't going to be hired on permanently. And what do? Well, why don't you travel? So I decided I didn't want to do Europe. It seemed boring to me. I decided to go to Africa instead. And at 23 years old, I joined an organized expedition which went from, these were run commercially at the time, from London, England to Nairobi, Kenya, through the Sahara, Congo, and East Central Africa to end up in Nairobi in the winter of 96, 97, North American, of course, conditions. The next year, I came back. I decided when I was in Nairobi to carry on my own, made my way down to South Africa, and had the privilege of spending about 3 weeks in April 1997 in Rhodesia. Now, at that time, the country was definitely involved in a major civil war that would lead to Zimbabwe 3 years later. And my journalistic instincts were incredibly inspired by the challenges that this country faced at that time with all the basic issues that were involved. But I didn't have any market for my stories. Remember, I was unemployed. And what am I going to do? I have no credentials really to write anything. I came back to Canada, not really knowing what I would do, and found a job on a small Alberta daily newspaper called the Medicine Hat News. And I went there in 1997 and struggled initially because I wasn't used to the context of working in a small daily newspaper like this. But I finally figured it out and regained the work ethic that I had on the student newspaper, writing several stories a day. Graduated graduated to become the desk editor or wire editor, and suddenly I was putting in this small Alberta town a whole lot of stories about Africa and Rhodesia on page one of this little daily newspaper. And then I had one of those classic epiphanies that several of which I shall show you later in further episodes. But I decided, what would it be to go back to Rhodesia and live through the end of that war? And could I do it? I had the money. I saved up some cash. Um, and I thought I could get the newspaper I worked for belonged to a national chain, and maybe I could arrange to write some stories from Africa for the national chain. So I sent a letter to their news service director saying I would go at my own expense and I would, can do this. And I got an introduction out of that to their Africa correspondent in Nairobi and started planning my trip. I ended up in Nairobi about in November 1978. And the correspondent there told me, look, Mark, you can do this, but you'd realize that if you go in as a journalist, you're going to be put on the next plane out of Rhodesia. They do not like foreigners, especially Western liberal journalists who are going to write stories that are not exactly favorable to the white regime. With that information in hand, I made my way down south, gathering information, preparing myself for the arrival in the country. I flew the flight. Of course, there's no direct flights between Black Africa and Rhodesia at the time. There was restrictions on the borders, but there was a place called Kazangula where you could cross over the Zambezi River from Zambia to Botswana, and then just cross over into Rhodesia at that point. That's what I did, and I told when I arrived in the country, I said I'm a student. They said fine, gave me the necessary tourist visa, and then I went looking for work. Well, then I got into the country, 1998, in December, and realized that there was no way this war was going to end in a couple of months, and I would run out of money before I would finish my mission, which was to see the thing through. So I did something quite creative. I went to the local daily newspaper chain called the Herald. I was in Salisbury at the time, the Rhodesia Herald. And I said, I'm happy to work in your second city, Bulawayo, which I knew was not the most desirable place, but I figured I'd increase my chance of getting hired if I said that. And I could be a sub-editor because I had that experience. They did some tests on me and said, yes, we're going to hire you. And they invited me to fly to Bulawayo. Then I went to the immigration department and said, I've been very fortunate. I've been hired as a trainee journalist at the Rhodesia Herald. Can I get a work permit? And they issued me one, stamped journalist. So now not only did I have a job, but I was legally in the country and able to survive the process. This led to a year and a half of my life, which I still consider to be one of the most interesting and challenging experiences of my life, because here I am, somewhat left of center, long haired young guy living in a country in the middle of a war, working for a local newspaper, handling the tasks of journalistic duties, and then writing stories freelance to the Canadian news agency. There were moments which were crazy. Someone reported me to the police at one point because obviously they saw I was sharing a house with some other people. And fortunately, I was able to get out of that by talking to the local authorities and saying, "Look, I'll agree, I won't write any more stories. I won't cause any more troubles." Um, um, and I was able to survive through all this at 25 years, 26 years old. I had a visit back to Canada. Then a few months later, sadly, my father died. And I didn't know how deathly ill he was. I knew he had diabetes, but because, of course, communication back then was not the way it is now. You write letters, you'd send, if telegrams were for important, very important things, and telephone, if you had a phone available to you, was life and death. So basically, I only got the call from my mother 12 hours before I got the final word that my father died. So I fly back to Vancouver in November 1978, late November, stay for about 3 weeks for the funeral. And that's just at the moment that the whole thing was coming to a conclusion in Rhodesia. The British government was taking over, the war was ending, the country was going to get its independence. There were going to be elections in a few months. And I decided that if I didn't go back to Africa to live through this stuff, I would be missing the whole purpose of my adventure. So I flew back to Africa. And I suppose the combination of my father's death, the fact that I was reaching the point of my discovery of this thing, this related to the whole point as we got through the independence period, that I was beginning to figure out who I was, the grand epiphany, which is another story I'll share with you in a future episode. Whatever. I did come home. I got back to Canada in 1980, April of 1980, after some further adventures in West Africa, and then faced the reality of where do I go with my life. I end up, after some very crappy jobs, working for the federal government in Ottawa, Canada, which is now where I live, in the communications department of the employment ministry. I got the job by going to the employment office of the employment ministry looking for a work, and the counselor offered me a job with the department. I suppose the reason he did this is because of my story about my African experiences, and he figured he'd be a good quality candidate for the civil servant, whatever. It was the height of the Reaganomics recession. This was not an easy time for anyone to find jobs anywhere, certainly in journalism. And I was being offered a public affairs communications job with the federal government at very good salary in Ottawa at a hard time. So I took it. It led to 5 years of pain because entrepreneurial people who go off to the middle of Africa to figure themselves out do not make good civil servants. I did eventually quit the government after 2 years, sold real estate for a couple of years, which surprised some people, but was very useful for learning about business, sales, and set up my first business out of publishing a regional publication for real estate agents. A year later, I started one for construction, and that began the seeds of my current business. So where am I? What am I? 71. I'm in good health. I have a happy family. I've got a lot to be thankful for. And I've seen a lot of people with problems and issues and difficulties who haven't found all the answers they're looking for. But I think I'm beginning to see what these things are. And I think that there's one thing that I learned from all these experiences is that sometimes going off the path that other people do and doing it in your own way is far better than just doing what everyone else says you should do. Sometimes you got to evolve paths which aren't straight and obviously you do things a little bit creatively, a little differently. And most importantly, you got to keep an open mind and a curiosity about the world and have fun. So I'm going to conclude this video with an invitation, if anyone's actually watching this, to make some comments, but if you're not, that's fine too. And I'll return, I don't know, probably tomorrow, and we'll carry on. Thanks, everyone, and I'll see you later.